Welcome to VOA interview. This is on Chhengpor from Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Recently, I sat down with Mr. Pablo Kang, Australian ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia. During the interview, we discussed a number of topics, including bilateral Australian-Cambodian relations, Canberra expectation of Cambodia Chairmanship of ASEAN in 2022, and the concern raised by some members of Cambodian-Australian community about alleged and potential interference by Cambodia ruling party in Australia, as well as the future of 2014 refugee deal between Australia and Cambodia. Good morning, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much for the opportunity for us to talk to you here in Phnom Penh. Your Foreign Minister, Madame Payne, was here in Phnom Penh earlier this month, or to be exact, last week. After her visit, we have seen a mass release of the jail activists. If I count now, until November 16, when we are talking right now, there are up to nearly 30 political activists have been released, even though it's a conditional release. Do you think Madam Minister visit have something to do with those release? Because it's just right after her visit to Phnom Penh.
Well, firstly, Chhengpor, thank you very much for interviewing me today, and hello to all of the viewers of VOA. The Minister for Foreign Affairs, also the Minister for Women, Senator the Honourable Marise Payne, had a very good visit last week. She pursued a number of issues in relation to both our bilateral relationship with Cambodia and also regional issues, which I'm sure you'll ask me about in a while. In relation to the issue that you mentioned, I don't know, I cannot speculate. Obviously, there have been a number of trials over the past year or so. Some of those have happened to come before the courts recently, but whether or not that had anything to do with the visit, I think you probably have to ask the courts or the government of Cambodia.
Mm-hmm. Did a minister raise the issue of the number of activists being politically motivated, charged in the court and being sent to the court due to their activism and expression with any of Cambodian officials during her visit?
Well, firstly, I might say, Chhengpor, that as an embassy here, we have been very consistent in raising issues around human rights, around the prosecution of activists, the detention of activists, and in some cases the sentencing of activists either based on political beliefs, representing environmental causes, causes relating to labour and trade unions. We've been raising our concerns around those issues consistently and regularly with the Cambodian government, both myself here at the embassy in Canberra, in multilateral forums such as the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, and as you would expect, in line with that consistent approach, the Minister did raise some of those issues in her discussions with the government.
Mm-hmm. Overall, what was the significant strategic and diplomatic result of Minister Payne's visit to Cambodia? It was 2 days, right?
Sure. Yes, a bit less. It was quite a jam-packed program of a bit over, over 2 days, as you say, but not 2 full days. So it was part of a broader regional visit that the Minister made to Malaysia, also Vietnam and Indonesia. But significantly, it was the first visit by an Australian Foreign Minister to Cambodia for about 7.5 years. Since February 2014 was the last time we had a visit from the Australian Foreign Minister. It was also the Minister's first visit to Cambodia for, I think, 16 years. And I think it was very timely in that perspective, and also because Cambodia has just taken over the chair of ASEAN, as you know, and so next year will be very busy with a number of ASEAN meetings throughout the course of the year, culminating in the Leaders Summit in late October, I believe. So it was very timely for us to engage face-to-face. Obviously, the Minister and other members of the government have had virtual interactions during the pandemic, but to actually be able to have a face-to-face visit, as you know, makes a big difference. So to talk very directly to both the Prime Minister and also the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation about our shared goals coming up with ASEAN next year as Cambodia is in the chair. And one of the other things, not just the timing, which followed very closely after Cambodia had taken over the chair of ASEAN, but also we had our first annual ASEAN-Australia Summit last month. Of course, it was online. Back then, Brunei was still in the chair of ASEAN, but the summit was online. But it was significant because it was the first annual Leaders Summit between ASEAN and Australia. So last year, ASEAN agreed that our summits be held on an annual basis. And as part of that, it was agreed that ASEAN and Australia enter into what we call a comprehensive strategic partnership, which is a very important signal of elevating Australia's relationship with ASEAN. Australia actually is the longest standing dialogue partner. It was the first dialogue partner for ASEAN nearly 50 years ago. And this is now entering a new era, a new level of cooperation where we have a comprehensive strategic partnership, which then brings with it a number of important programs. So my Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, Australian Prime Minister, announced at that first annual ASEAN-Australia Leaders Summit about $154 million Australian dollars worth of new initiatives, Australia for ASEAN Futures, to basically make sure that the work that we do, the cooperation that we do, the development assistance that we provide through ASEAN and to individual ASEAN member states is targeted at ASEAN's key priorities, whether it be, of course, primarily recovery from the pandemic, whether that be in the area of health security, whether that be in the area of economic recovery. We want to see business and tourism and intra-regional travel coming back. So we have some very targeted programs around that. We have some new scholarships that we are offering for students from ASEAN to go to Australia. We also have a number of scholarships in the vocational education and training sectors, as all part of our support for the digitization agenda of ASEAN. I think what the pandemic, if anything, has showed is that digitalization, not just of meetings, but of policies or platforms, will be very important going forward, even after the pandemic has been brought under control. I think it's shown us the new way of working and including the new way that economies operate, whether that be things like supporting e-commerce. Of course, in Cambodia, we're very fortunate. We've had Cambodia has a very strong platform in e-commerce even before COVID, which I think is only just the pandemic has helped to actually grow, including, I think, access for women entrepreneurs, women who play a very strong role in the small and medium enterprise sector. So these are all aspects of the announcements that the Prime Minister made at the first annual Australia-ASEAN Leaders Summit, coinciding with the decision by ASEAN to elevate Australia's relationship to that of a comprehensive strategic partner.
The elevation make Australia even more important partner of ASEAN. So as the status of that important partner of ASEAN, what are Australia's expectations of Cambodia as the chair of ASEAN in 2022 with regard to key regional issues, including the South China Sea and the broader Indo-Pacific security landscape?
Very good question, Chhengpor, and Cambodia will have a challenging but potentially rewarding role. I think it's not easy being chair of ASEAN, and of course, as you rightly point out, there are a number of regional strategic issues which are not new issues necessarily, but continue to be points of difference or points of tension in the region. You mentioned the South China Sea. I think that is obviously going to continue to be a focus in the ASEAN and related meetings next year. I think we've been quite consistent in terms of the South China Sea. It's a very important waterway for Australia, international waterway. A lot of our trade through to North Asia and other parts of Southeast Asia goes through the South China Sea. We've been very consistent in arguing that, for example, there is currently a code of conduct negotiations, and that Australia is important. It's important for us to emphasise freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight in the international waters in the South China Sea, freedom to conduct natural exploration activities or joint naval exercises. So that's our primary goal. And the South China Sea will I'm sure be something that's discussed quite a lot next year. But I think the main topic that perhaps hasn't been as much of a focus, because it's still quite new, is the situation in Myanmar following the coup there in February. And obviously Australia has been watching developments very closely. We've provided a lot of support for humanitarian relief into Myanmar, because we know obviously that the conflict there has exacerbated the situation on the ground in terms of people's access to badly needed humanitarian supplies, including on top of the fact that we still have COVID-19 as well. So Australia is also very keen to support ASEAN's approach to make sure that the 5-point consensus, which ASEAN leaders agreed to, including Myanmar, in April this year at their special summit in Jakarta, is fully implemented. So we are there to support ASEAN in whatever way we can to make sure that happens. So Cambodia's role will be very important as the chair of ASEAN, and of course as the chair it's a slightly different role from being a member state attending ASEAN meetings, because of course as the chair you have to play this balancing role, making sure that all relevant interests and views are heard and are conveyed during the ASEAN meetings and the related meetings.
Mm-hmm. Back in Australia, there was some case about the Chinese presence. I mean, that prompted Australia to legislate even the anti-interference law. For based on those experience, and you see your first-hand experience here with an increasing significant Chinese political and economic presence here in Cambodia, does it concern you or Canberra about this kind of dominance that the Chinese may have on Cambodia, especially when Cambodia is taking the helm of ASEAN Chairmanship next year?
Well, Cambodia is a sovereign country, and of course Cambodia welcomes investment and trade from many different countries, including from China, of course, including from Australia. We don't comment on the normal sort of trade and investment relationships that countries have. We do know that China is a major investor in Cambodia, and certainly it's a major trading partner. I think Cambodia and China recently signed a free trade agreement, as Cambodia also did with the Republic of Korea. We also know that, for example, the United States is Cambodia's principal export destination, and a country to which actually exports have been growing despite COVID. So I think Cambodia has a range of different partners with whom that they do trade and investment. From Australia's perspective, we very much like to see, and it's part of my role, is to encourage more Australian trade and investment with Cambodia. Good for us, of course, good for Cambodia, good for Cambodia's recovery from COVID. I guess before the pandemic, Cambodia was averaging about 7% annual growth, which was tremendous. And you can see that in the change that is taking place in Cambodia with, there's a growing middle class. There's been great inroads into poverty reduction over the last few decades, and we want to see that continue. And of course, COVID has temporarily put the brakes on that. But like a lot of other countries, Cambodia and Australia, we're trying to look forward now to a bounce back, I think, in terms of economic recovery. We've seen actually, even though Australia's trade with Cambodia is come off a fairly low base, it's actually grown also during the pandemic. So two-way trade between Australia and Cambodia is worth over 700 million Australian dollars. And there's been a steady growth in things like exports of Cambodian rice to Australia. I think education services that we export to Cambodia are still quite highly valued during the pandemic, and we're looking forward to seeing Cambodian students be able to return to do face-to-face study in Australia next year. On the investment space, we're also trying to encourage more Australian investment. I think you know, Chhengpor, there was a gold mine, Australian owned and operated gold mine, which started in Mondulkiri province in June this year. It started pouring gold after many years of exploration and environmental impact assessment, community consultation, socially responsible preparations for the commencement of operations. So that started, and I think that was a $120 million US investment by the company, and we hope that would also pave the way for further interest from Australia into Cambodia.
With regard to the security issue and the Indo-Pacific security cooperation, the Australian Navy, the Royal Navy, Australian Royal Navy warship HMAS Anzac was here in Cambodia several weeks back, and the officer of Australia have met their Cambodian colleague as well, and you were there in Sihanoukville as well. Were Australian officer be told about the plan for Cambodia plan for the Ream naval base, which is the Cambodia just accept that they are accepting assistance from China to modernize the base, that from the US and other concerned that it could be exclusive for China, but Prime Minister Hun Sen also made it clear that would not be exclusive for China and would be open for anyone. Were you or other Australian officers were told during the trip of the Anzacs of Cambodian plan for the Ream naval base?
Well, firstly, Chhengpor, can I say it was a very successful visit from our perspective. It was the first Australian naval ship to visit Cambodia in 5 years. HMAS Anzac, it was part of a regional maritime exercise that we hold every year called Indo-Pacific Endeavour. We're very fortunate that HMAS Anzac was able to dock in Sihanoukville, and we wanted to thank the Cambodian authorities for making that happen. Also, the ship brought around 800 kilograms of medical equipment with it, which it offloaded in Sihanoukville, medical equipment that was requested both by the Royal Cambodian Armed Forces and the Sihanouk provincial government. Things, you know, pretty basic things, some of them, like PPE, uniforms, surgical gloves, masks, bandages, medical trays, that will be put to good use. The crew of the ship also conducted a virtual Women, Peace and Security seminar with Cambodian Armed Forces while it was here. And I think that was in recognition of the fact that both Australia and Cambodia have a lot of experience in this area, both in terms of, for example, peacekeeping operations. Of course, many women increasingly from the Cambodian Armed Forces deploy overseas on peacekeeping operations. Australia's also had a lot of experience in terms of our response to COVID in our region and the role that women in the military have played. Also demining, which is something that we support very actively in Cambodia. There's, I think, 27% of people involved in the mine action sector in Cambodia are women, and that is growing, and we support financially projects aimed at furthering the cause of making Cambodia mine-free by 2025. So there were a number of topics that we discussed there. And then there was key leader engagement between the commander of the Indo-Pacific Endeavour Task Group and the Cambodian side. Of course, like we've been you know, very clear in terms of the situation at Ream. Clearly, we welcomed the continuing, I guess, assurances from the Cambodian side that there will be no exclusive use for the Ream naval base for any country. Of course, it is a Cambodian naval base, and I know that the Prime Minister and others have talked a lot about the Constitution, which of course precludes foreign basing. It talks a lot about neutrality and sovereignty and those sort of issues. So that's a conversation that we continue to have with Cambodia. We have a long history of defence cooperation here, dating back to the UNTAC period. In the early 1990s, General John Sanderson, who was the head of the military component of UNTAC, we had over 1,200 Australian Defence Force personnel that were deployed to Cambodia during UNTAC, and then our defence cooperation program has continued since then. So we're very keen to continue to work with Cambodia and other regional countries to help ensure a safe and secure region.
Recently, I would recall back in September, there was a hearing in the Australian Parliament, namely the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, about potential Cambodian government interference into Australian community. The witnesses, including the activists and member of the Cambodian Australian diaspora in Australia, complain about the presence and the infiltration of the Cambodian People Party into Australia, setting up zone, making division, and they raise concern that this is as much a potential interference like Australia is aiming at the Chinese Communist Party. Can you confirm whether those can be counted as interference, whether interference from Cambodian government into Australian community have taken place, and have Australian government taken any action on that?
Thank you for the question. First thing to say, I think, is that there is a very active and welcome diaspora Australians of Cambodian background in Australia. So we think there are around 66,000 Australians now who can trace their ethnic background to Cambodia. Of course, I think there are a lot of Cambodians who obviously had to leave during the Khmer Rouge period, and quite a few of them ended up in Australia as refugees, and then we've seen migration since then. So I think in different parts of Australia there's a very broad and active diaspora, and there's many different views that are represented in that diaspora. In terms of the specific issue that you mentioned, I can't really comment on that. I haven't had any personal observation of that because I'm based in Cambodia, obviously. But we have encouraged anyone who raises these issues to please ensure that they raise them with the appropriate authorities to warrant further investigation.
At the same time, when those activists mentioned about the timeline of the potential interference, there have been reports about a member of the Cambodian political and economic elites making investments, making a financial flow into Australia, buying real estate, open up business. And the concern were there as well, was mentioned at the same time during the committee hearing that Australian government is not doing enough to investigate those sources of funding and finance. Is Australian government being investigating, taking any action to ensure that the source of money is not illicit and is not related to somehow potential allegation of money laundering?
Well, Australia has a very active anti-money laundering position worldwide. In fact, we cooperate very closely with Cambodia on anti-money laundering because obviously Cambodia's geographic position in this part of Southeast Asia makes it potentially vulnerable to money laundering activities coming through the region, and sometimes they're related to things like narcotics trafficking, for example. So we do have actually quite a bit of cooperation at a police-to-police level on issues to do with money laundering. But again, as I said, like in terms of if people have any concerns in Australia, then they should raise them with the appropriate authorities for further investigation. I think the committee hearing was one way of doing that, but there are other channels of doing that in Australia as well.
Do you know if any action have been taking place against those kinds to investigate the claims?
Probably asking the wrong person on that, Chhengpor, based here.
Australia is the U.S. ally, but both countries may have a different policy and different stand on some issue. Recently, the U.S. have, since mid-2018, the U.S. have invoked the Global Magnitsky Act to sanction a businessman and a former military general, at least until now, who are close to the Prime Minister Hun Sen over alleged corruption and human rights violation. Would Australia do the same? Because I understand now the Magnitsky Act is being legislated in Australian Parliament or legal making process. Is it happening? And if Australia is looking into the issue of this kind of thing?
Well, you're right to say, Chhengpor, that we are reviewing our autonomous sanctions legislation. We don't call it the Magnitsky Act. I think that's obviously a very specific piece of legislation in another country, but we are reviewing our autonomous sanctions legislation, looking at all these sort of issues. What application that has for individuals is still yet to be determined because the legislation has not been fully developed yet.
Ambassador, because Cambodia is approaching 2022 and 2023 elections, from Australian perspective, what are the minimum requirements, or what can make those elections credible, free and fair? When now you may have heard you met opposition leader Kam Sukha, the main opposition party was Spain. Many activists are subject to being the judicial monitoring after their release. What make the election free and fair and credible in your view?
It's a very good question, and I guess inherently the answer is going to be a bit subjective, right? Of course, we're very well aware that there are commune elections in 2022 and the national elections in 2023, and Cambodia's constitution says up front that Cambodia is a liberal multi-party democracy. So we want to make sure, to the extent that we can certainly play a small role, I guess, that the conduct of those elections, in both in 2022 and 2023, lives up to the wording in the Constitution itself. We've made quite clear, privately and publicly, it's certainly no secret, that Australia encourages political dialogue, political discussion, reconciliation between the Cambodian government, opposition groups, civil society, to rebuild relations in the lead up to those elections so that they can be held freely and fairly, that people feel free to go and cast their vote, to campaign, to run for office, and that there are a range of genuine political parties contesting those elections. That's something that we have felt quite strongly about, we've spoken about. As I said, no real secret. We've raised these issues with the Cambodian government. We do support the work that civil society is doing and will do in the run-up to those elections, and we'll be providing some additional support as we get closer to the time. So yes, it's something that we'll be looking at very closely and trying to assist in the best way that we can.
In this last section of the interview, I would like to discuss you about 2014 deal between Cambodia and Australia to transfer voluntary asylum seeker from the narrow island to Cambodia, which cost Australia, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's 40 million Australian dollar to assist Cambodia in resettle those asylum seekers who voluntarily would like to come here. By the end of the deal in 2018, if I count 10 refugee asylum seekers did came here, and 9 of them left Cambodia. The last one I do not have record on whether he or she is still in the country. For this amount of assistance and financial aid to Cambodia to facilitate the deals and the number of asylum seekers coming here, you see the deal as a failure or success to Australia?
Chhengpor, that deal, that agreement, I guess, was done at a very specific time for a very specific purpose. Australia has a very strong record of ensuring that we do not do anything to encourage illegal people smuggling to our country, because once that happens, it's a very dangerous practice. We've seen in the past unfortunately many illegal asylum seekers who have tried to make it to Australia. They They pay people smugglers a lot of money. They get put on very small, unseaworthy boats, for example, from ports in Indonesia to try and make it to a place like Christmas Island, which is obviously part of Australian territory. Unfortunately, we've seen many people drown in that attempt. And I think what we wanted to do at that time is to put in place very strong disincentives so that people do not try and do that. One of those disincentives, of course, was that for anyone who did make it to Australian territory to be resettled in another country. Because if they were able to be resettled in Australia, then other people might think, well, if I try and make that dangerous journey, then I could end up being successful as well. And so then we'd have a vicious cycle of people trying to do that. So that was the context at the time. As you said, it's an agreement that has come and passed. Australia continues to provide a lot of development assistance cooperation to Cambodia since that agreement. So just because the agreement has finished, that doesn't mean that Australia's development assistance program has somehow been negatively affected. We provide roughly $50 million US dollars worth of development assistance to Cambodia on an annual basis. We provide that with a strong focus on assisting women, persons with a disability, looking at the agriculture sector, trying to help with infrastructure needs. I mentioned demining before. That's a big part of our assistance there as well. Our ongoing funding to the Khmer tribunals as they wrap up the work that they're doing, very important work into the prosecution of former Khmer leaders. So there's a lot of development assistance happening, on top of which, since the pandemic, we've had a couple of new initiatives, one being a Mekong-Australia partnership, which Prime Minister Morrison announced about a year ago, and as its name suggests, it's focused on the 5 countries of the Mekong sub-region and their partnership with Australia. And for Cambodia, there's a lot of really important initiatives that have been commenced, some of which we discussed when the Foreign Minister was here last week. For example, we have now a new consumer protection program where we pair the Ministry of Commerce here with the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. And that is basically to make sure that consumers in Cambodia can make informed choices about the products that are being offered and the products that they can buy, including on sensitive topics like fake medicines, for example, which I know is a big issue here. Another big part of the Mekong-Australia partnership is our support for human resource development. So I just last week spoke to the 55 Cambodian scholarship awardees who will be travelling to Australia next year. 10 of those are under the Mekong-Australia partnership. So there's additional scholarships that we're providing for Cambodia to help improve human resource development, as well as to conduct short courses and training for Cambodian officials. So just this last 2 weeks, for example, we've provided some law of the sea training, which, as you've said earlier, might be quite a useful thing to do in advance of the ASEAN meetings that Cambodia will be chairing next year. And that was done through the Mekong-Australia partnership and the University of Wollongong in Australia. So there's a lot that's happening in the development assistance space, of course, with vaccines. We've been very committed to helping Cambodia and other countries in Southeast Asia to have access to vaccines and to support delivery of vaccines. And we're very keen that happen in Cambodia, and that's what a lot of our support is directed to as well. So that's a very long way of answering your question about the link between that agreement back in 2014 and development cooperation. Just to say that development cooperation is ongoing, and in fact, in some cases, increasing, even though that agreement is now finished.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison himself was then the Australian immigration minister who came here in Phnom Penh 2014 to sign the deal. And Prime Minister Hun Sen in 2018 told Australian journalists that he also showed the interest to then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull that Cambodia would like to renew the deal. is Canberra or Phnom Penh have been in talk, or will they renew this refugee deal right now or in the future?
Well, as I said, that was a very specific agreement for a very specific circumstance.
No.
Well, not at the moment, no.
Okay. Final question, Ambassador. You have been here in Cambodia for some time. From your perspective, from Australia perspective, how important Cambodia is to Australia as a country?
Very important. Of course, you'd expect me to say that. I'm our ambassador to Cambodia. But no, I think there's a lot of people. I mentioned the diaspora, 66,000. So the people-to-people links, not just the people who live in Australia, but also the students. So we have nearly 3,000 Cambodian students enrolled at Australian universities, world-leading universities in most cases. And we're looking to obviously continue that once borders reopen, both in Australia and Cambodia following COVID. It's those kind of links, the students, the diaspora. We're looking also next year to welcome Australian university students back to Cambodia. We have a program called the New Colombo Plan. Of course, it's been suspended during COVID because of the difficulty of travelling. But I think with Cambodia's borders opening again, we're looking to get more Australian university students back to Cambodia. When I first arrived here, at the beginning of 2020, we were actually planning to have over 500 Australian students coming to Cambodia in 2020. And then COVID coming, right? So, but we're looking very much to restart that program because, you know, we talk a lot about government-to-government cooperation, which of course is very important, and official cooperation like that. But the real strength of any relationship, I think, is in the people-to-people links, including trade and investment that we also discussed briefly. Next year is a very significant year in the history of Australia-Cambodia relations, however, because next year is actually the 70th anniversary of the establishment of bilateral relations between Australia and Cambodia. So back on the 15th of January 1952, which is of course before Cambodia officially gained independence from France, about a year before, Australia and Cambodia entered into a diplomatic relationship, which of course continues to this day. So next year we're marking the 70th anniversary of that. Of course, it's also coinciding with a couple of other important events. We talked about Cambodia's ASEAN Chair Year next year. Next year is also the 30th anniversary of the commencement of the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, UNTAC, which started in early 1992. And of course, I've mentioned the role that Australia played in UNTAC. So there's a few things coming together next year, which I think as an ambassador here, as our embassy here, would like to highlight, to talk about the breadth, the depth and the history of Australia-Cambodia relations, which remain very important. Australia is, you know, I think we look at Southeast Asia, it's part of our neighbourhood. That's why we support ASEAN in a lot of its initiatives. That's why we are now a comprehensive strategic partner of ASEAN. We have these annual summit meetings. We have a lot of cooperation programs, and Cambodia as a key member of ASEAN will always be an important country for Australia, and I hope vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for taking your time and answer all of these questions that Cambodians in both countries and as well as Australian should know about from you as ambassador here in Cambodia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chhengpor.